My name is Daniel Whitaker, and until this morning, I was the Chief Financial Officer at ArcLight Components, a manufacturing firm based in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm 63. I joined when we were still operating out of 3 old warehouses near the riverfront, back when Harold Klein, the founder, still answered his own phone. 15 years later, we're a publicly traded operation with facilities across 5 states. Before I continue, if you've ever been overlooked, undervalued, or replaced without warning, please underscore this. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share this story. You might know someone who needs to hear it. I've never been one for flash. I didn't charm investors or show up to strategy offsites with slideshows full of buzzwords. But the numbers were right. The reports were clean. The SEC never once called on my watch. Then came Lucas Bennett, 37, all tailored suits and cryptic metaphors. He arrived 3 months ago as our new CEO. Said we needed vision realignment. I didn't need a crystal ball to see where it was heading. Today, he leaned back in my chair, feet propped up like he owned more than just the title. The market's evolving, Dan. We need someone who speaks the language of now. Then he dropped the name. Eli Barrett, 30, fintech darling, famous for a flashy TEDx talk and a lot of words that meant very little to people who actually read balance sheets. I nodded, one nod, one handshake, and packed up 15 years of loyalty into a cardboard box. I didn't say much on my way out. Just nodded at a few familiar faces who didn't know where to look. While most of the staff gathered in the main conference room for another exciting direction presentation, I quietly loaded my box into the trunk of my old Honda. 15 years, and it all fit in there. Family photos, a bronze coin from our IPO, the leather folio Catherine gave me before she passed. I drove without thinking, ending up across the river in East Alton, where I used to help my dad run a tiny hardware store. That place taught me everything I know. How to count cash by hand, track every bolt and washer, and above all, how to read people without them saying a word. My father had one rule. The numbers don't lie, even when people do. That line carried me through accounting school, late nights balancing books, and decades of working my way up through companies that barely remember my name now. When Harold Klein called me in 2008 and asked me to help keep ArcLight alive during the recession, I didn't hesitate. I don't need a rock star, he told me. I need someone who sleeps better when the books balance. And for a long time, we built something steady, real growth, real stability. When Harold retired, his replacement, Monica Reyes, respected that system. We didn't always agree, but she listened. We made decisions based on what was right, not just what would trend well on LinkedIn. That era ended the day Lucas showed up. The first red flag came just 2 weeks after Lucas settled into his corner office. He bypassed our procurement process to bring in a flashy branding firm from Chicago, Stratus Edge, led by a former classmate of his. Their fee? 4 times our standard rate. When I questioned it, he smiled like I'd just failed a vision test. "We're thinking bigger now, Daniel," he said. "Old constraints don't apply anymore." The second flag followed shortly after. Lucas restructured our reporting lines so that the finance department no longer reported directly to the CEO, but instead to a newly created position, Chief Innovation Officer, someone he brought in from his last venture. Suddenly, every number we sent up had to pass through a filter of narrative alignment. But the third flag hit harder. I overheard Lucas on a call, telling someone that the books at ArcLight use outdated methodology and that creative financial architecture would be needed to modernize. Those words, creative architecture, They weren't just buzzwords, they were warnings. So I started paying closer attention. I combed through vendor contracts that didn't match our historical patterns. I flagged consulting invoices with no scope of work. I saw budget reallocations happening without the proper department head sign-offs. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. And it was growing clearer by the day. Something underhanded was taking root at ArcLight. It wasn't long before my team started noticing the same cracks I did. Kevin Miller, one of our sharpest internal auditors, stopped by late one evening as I reviewed the Q2 ledgers. His face was tense, voice low. "Something's off with the new tech vendor entries," he said, tapping the edge of my desk. "Numbers aren't reconciling from invoice to ledger." "Document everything," I told him. "Keep it clean. Keep it factual." If Catherine were still here, she would have told me to call a board meeting, raise hell, force transparency. But cancer took her 3 years ago, and since then, I'd changed. Less fire, maybe, more focus. So instead of confrontation, I started compiling records. Quietly, patiently. Downloaded every questionable transaction, cross-referenced vendor logs, flagged irregular entries that bypassed our usual controls. All while maintaining the same steady tone in meetings, even as Lucas brought in more of his people and began nudging out mine. I wasn't imagining this. These weren't isolated oversights. This was coordinated, precise, intentional. And every path led back to Eli Barrett, the wunderkind being groomed as my replacement. His name popped up on more than one internal email trail, each one linked to strategic partnerships that didn't smell right. Whatever was happening at ArcLight, it wasn't just about replacing an old-school CFO. It was about getting rid of the one person still watching the numbers too closely. My final board meeting lasted just under 25 minutes. No speech, no handshake, no framed photo or farewell gift. Just a cold bullet point on the agenda labeled CFO Transition. Lucas did most of the talking, rambling on about next-gen capital frameworks and modern liquidity ecosystems. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, watching him flip through slides built on numbers my team had compiled. Walter Hammond, our chairman, never looked me in the eye. He'd been on the board since before I was hired, back when ArcLight was still family-owned. Now, he simply nodded along as Lucas introduced Eli Barrett like a shiny new gadget that promised to redefine fiscal strategy. I waited for some acknowledgement, anything to recognize the 15 years we spent building ArcLight into something steady. But the meeting moved on to the next item. Lucas's plan to move our headquarters into a sleek, high-rise downtown, complete with a meditation room and rooftop cafe. As the room emptied, Walter finally approached. He placed a hand awkwardly on my shoulder and muttered, "You've been an asset, Daniel." An asset, like office equipment, useful until replaced. I returned to what was now Eli's office to collect my box. Through the glass, I watched Lucas pointing at the legacy charts I'd kept on the wall, speaking to Eli as if they were relics from another century. Bethany, from accounts, was waiting by the door. She handed me an envelope. "We took up a collection," she said softly, "for a proper send-off dinner." I smiled. "Thank you," knowing full well I'd never use it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, every square inch covered in printed reports, USB drives, and a yellow legal pad I hadn't used in years. 15 years of financial stewardship, reduced to a private investigation in my own dining room. But the patterns were there. Transactions routed through unfamiliar vendors, consulting fees paid out with no clear scope, and most damning wire transfers tied to a company called Clearstone Ventures. Clearstone had shown up just weeks before Lucas officially became CEO. At first glance, it looked legitimate. But as I peeled back the filings, the red flags became neon. The address led to a virtual office in Austin. The listed CEO was a dead end, and the company had no digital footprint outside of our own ledgers. Then it clicked. I cross-referenced dates. Clearstone's first invoice appeared exactly 2 weeks before Lucas first mentioned bringing Eli on board. They didn't hire Eli because I was too old school. They hired him to facilitate a scheme already in motion. I wasn't just replaced, I was removed. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the wall where Catherine's framed photo still hung. For the first time since she passed, I felt something cut through the fog. Not grief, not anger. Focus. They thought I'd leave quietly. But they forgot one thing. I don't bluff, I document. And the numbers, they never lie. The next morning, I called Walter Hammond's office. Despite the cold goodbye, he'd always struck me as fair. Cautious, yes, but not malicious. I figured he deserved a quiet heads up before things unraveled. I left a message with his assistant. Some financial concerns from my final weeks, nothing urgent, but worth reviewing. He returned the call the following day. His voice was guarded. Daniel, good to hear from you. Lucas mentioned you might reach out. My gut tightened. He did? Yes, Walter continued. Said you were having a tough time with the transition. Mentioned concerns you had about Eli's systems, but that everything's already been addressed. Walter, I said carefully, some of these irregularities go back before Eli even joined. There was silence. Then, almost rehearsed. Look, Daniel, I understand it's difficult. 15 years is a long time. But the board has full confidence in Lucas's direction, and Eli's already fixed several inefficiencies. That's not... I'm afraid I have another call, he cut in. Perhaps we'll catch up at the holiday gathering. I hear Lucas is still keeping you on the invite list. Very thoughtful. Thoughtful. As if a party invite could make this right. An hour later, I got an email from ArcLight's legal team. Polite but pointed. A reminder of my confidentiality agreement, and a warning that unfounded accusations could be considered defamatory. They weren't just closing the door behind me. They were locking it shut. That evening, I reached out to the one person I still trusted inside ArcLight, Kevin Miller. He agreed to meet at a diner just outside of town, a quiet spot where we wouldn't be noticed. When he walked in, he looked 10 years older. They promoted me, he said before I could even sit down. New title, bigger office. I report directly to Eli now. Congrats, I replied, keeping my tone level. How's that working out? Kevin stirred his coffee, eyes darting toward the window. They've overhauled everything, new software, new protocols. Eli says it's streamlined, but... He leaned in. It's hard to trace anything. No audit trails. And they had me sign additional NDAs. Everyone who worked with you is being watched. I felt my jaw clench. They're saying things, aren't they? He nodded. Whispers that you resisted change, that your Q3 numbers had inconsistencies, Eli corrected. Some are even implying ethical issues. My stomach dropped. Not only had they pushed me out, they were rewriting the narrative. I can't risk it, Dan, Kevin said, sliding a 20 on the table. Twins starting college. Mortgage is tight. I get it, I said, forcing a smile. Take care of your family. As he walked out, I stayed behind, gripping my coffee mug with both hands, holding myself together. They weren't just trying to erase me. They were trying to discredit me. They thought I'd go quietly, that I'd pack up my framed degrees and leave behind nothing but dust and memory. What they didn't know was that during my final week at ArcLight, I'd set up a contingency, an emergency admin account buried in the audit server. Standard practice during system transitions. No one questioned it. No one looked. That night, after Kevin walked away, and the legal threats landed in my inbox, I logged in. The credentials still worked. I didn't know how long I had before the system flagged the activity, so I moved quickly. I followed every suspicious trail I'd previously flagged, only this time deeper. What I found made my earlier suspicions feel like child's play. Clearstone Ventures wasn't a standalone operation. It was part of a larger network of shell companies, all interconnected through layers of shadow payments and bogus contracts. Some of them predated Lucas's arrival. One even linked back to a VC group that held 3 seats on our board, including the one now filled by Walter Hammond's nephew, Jacob. This wasn't a simple case of embezzlement. It was strategic infiltration, a long game. ArcLight wasn't being led. It was being bled. I spent the next several hours downloading, organizing, time-stamping. Everything was mapped: dates, amounts, sign-offs, vendor links. By dawn, I'd traced over $11.7 million that had quietly vanished into modernization expenses. Catherine used to say, "Truth doesn't shout. It waits." And now, it was time to make sure someone finally heard it. The building was mostly empty by the time I pulled into the garage. I used my old security badge, still active, surprisingly, and took the elevator straight to the executive floor. No one stopped me. The boardroom looked just as it had for years. Polished mahogany table, 12 high-backed chairs, that faint citrus scent from the cleaning staff who scrubbed it down every evening like it was sacred ground. I stood by the window for a moment, staring out at the St. Louis skyline. So many decisions had been made in that room, some easy, some brutal. Layoffs, expansions, supplier negotiations, internal promotions. Catherine always said I carried the weight of ArcLight on my back, and I suppose I did. Not out of pride, but of duty. I walked slowly around the table, running my fingers across the chairs. Walter used to sit here, Monica there. Harold always at the end, firm but fair. Now it was Lucas's space, his stage. I sat down in the chair I always used. My chair. I closed my eyes, listening to the silence. No buzzwords, no flashy decks, just memory. Then I opened my laptop and connected to the private server one last time. A final sweep for anything I might have missed. Tucked away in a subfolder labeled Strategic Partnerships was a revised contract, unsigned, showing a new wave of vendor deals about to be pushed through. They weren't done bleeding ArcLight, but neither was I. The next morning, I spread out everything I had on the dining room table. Dozens of files, spreadsheets, and a flowchart that looked more like a crime board than financial documentation. Names, dates, account trails. And at the center of it all, Clearstone Ventures, tied to every questionable vendor through a maze of false billing and overinflated service contracts. Lucas hadn't just hired Eli to modernize finance. He'd brought him in to legitimize a siphoning system already underway. And with Jacob Hammond sitting quietly on the board, Walter's own nephew, this wasn't just executive misconduct. It was a coordinated, internal campaign to gut ArcLight from the inside out. My first instinct had been to alert the board. But now, I knew better. Some of them were part of it. Diana Reyes's quiet replacement with Lucas suddenly made sense. She had always pushed for tighter compliance. Instead, I focused on the 3 board members I believed still had integrity. Elaine Monroe, a retired operations exec who had joined last year. David Lynn, representing the employees' pension fund. And Gerald Watts, the oldest on the board. Quiet, but sharp. I began drafting personalized emails. Not accusations, just carefully framed observations. I included selected attachments, enough to raise concern, not panic. Then I scheduled them to send in 48 hours. If anything happened to me before then, at least the truth would start whispering in the right ears. My phone rang just past noon the next day. Blocked number. I hesitated, then answered. "Is this Daniel Whitaker?" a woman asked. Her voice was calm, professional. "Speaking. My name is Natalie Brenner, with the Securities and Exchange Commission's Enforcement Division. We've received an anonymous tip regarding possible financial irregularities at ArcLight Components. Your name was mentioned as someone who may have relevant information." My heart paused, just for a beat. "I recently stepped down as CFO," I said carefully. 15 years with the company." "Yes, we're aware," she replied. "Would you be open to meeting informally to discuss a few transactions from the past 6 months?" I glanced at the file still sitting on the table, then back out the window toward the river. "Who else knows you're contacting me?" "No one outside my immediate team. This is preliminary, not a formal investigation yet." I nodded slowly, though she couldn't see. Someone had already blown the whistle. The clock had started ticking. If ArcLight went under, people like Bethany would suffer. Hundreds of employees, families, pensions. "I'll need a bit of time," I said. "To consider cooperating?" "No," I replied. "To make sure I get this right. I gave myself 3 days. That's all. 3 days to prepare everything in a way no one could silence, edit, or bury. First, I backed up all my documentation. Cloud, hard drive, encrypted flash. Then I set up deadman switches. If I didn't log in every 48 hours, the full package, every invoice, every shell company connection, every signature, would automatically go to the SEC, the Department of Justice, and 3 journalists who still believed in long-form reporting. Then came the emails. I finalized drafts to Elaine, David, and Gerald, the 3 board members I still had some faith in. I didn't accuse. I didn't rant. I simply shared what I'd seen, what I'd found, and why I believed a deeper look was warranted. Enough to raise eyebrows, enough to buy time. They were scheduled to send in 2 days. Last, I reached out to Bethany. We met at a small cafe near the commuter rail. She looked tired, not defeated, just worn thin. "They're gutting finance," she whispered. "Eli calls it streamlining. Half the team's been reassigned, the rest of us are being reviewed. And you?" "I've been told my role is being dissolved. 22 years, Daniel." Her voice trembled. "They gave me 6 weeks to find a new spot or take a package." I nodded, then slid a sealed envelope across the table. Inside was a formal report, clean, legal, and well within her duties as a senior accounting manager. "You submit this to internal audit?" I said gently. "They can't retaliate without triggering whistleblower protection." She looked down at the envelope, then back at me. "This is really happening, isn't it?" I met her eyes. It already has. On my way home, I made 2 more stops. First, at a notary public, where I signed and certified a detailed affidavit outlining everything I'd uncovered. Dates, vendors, amounts, sworn testimony that couldn't be dismissed as rumor. Then I visited my attorney and left a sealed set of instructions to be opened only if something happened to me. That night, as the city lights flickered to life across the river, I received a text from Kevin. Z asking about old audit protocols. "Seems nervous. Watch yourself." They were finally noticing. The cracks I'd left behind were widening. They'd spent so much time orchestrating my exit, They hadn't considered what I might have taken with me, or worse, what I'd already set in motion. The next morning, Bethany sent a simple message. Submitted. Internal audit timestamp, 9:13 a.m. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from certainty. There was no turning back now. Everything was in place. The evidence, the whistleblower trigger, the scheduled board emails, the SEC contact. It had taken weeks of quiet work, late nights, and steady hands. But I hadn't just left quietly. I'd left a fuse behind. And the countdown had begun. 6 weeks after I walked out of ArcLight, everything hit at once. Bethany's internal audit submission triggered a review that landed on Eli's desk the same morning my emails reached Elaine, David, and Gerald. By noon, Elaine, using her authority as audit committee chair, called for an emergency board meeting. I wasn't in the room, but Bethany kept me updated. 2:04 p.m. Board assembled. Lucas looks pale. 2:17 p.m. Eli escorted to legal conference room. 2:40 p.m. Outside auditors arriving. Everyone tense. By evening, the news had leaked internally. ArcLight Components was officially under investigation for financial misconduct. Every executive hired under Lucas was placed on immediate administrative leave pending a forensic audit. I turned off my phone and took a long walk by the river. The skyline was glowing, but quieter than usual. I didn't feel triumphant, just steady. They hadn't seen it coming, not because I was clever, but because they assumed I was finished, outdated, erased. But numbers remember. They whisper when no one else will. The next morning I woke up to 3 missed calls. Walter, Lucas, and Jacob. I didn't return any of them. Instead, I answered the 4th call, Gerald Watts. 15 years of clean books, Daniel, he said, voice gravelly with age. I should have said something sooner. You're saying it now, I replied. And that was enough. The board has voted, Gerald told me. Lucas and Eli have been terminated for cause. Walter and Jacob resigned this morning. 2 others followed. I've been appointed acting chairman until we stabilize. I listened quietly, the weight of his words slowly landing. We'd like you to come back, Daniel, temporarily. Help the forensic team. Steady the transition. No press, no noise, just clean the mess. I stared out at the river, watching a barge drift past like it had all the time in the world. Calm, unshaken. I'll assist with the investigation, I said finally. But I'm not coming back for good. Gerald hesitated. May I ask why? I smiled just a little. Because ArcLight needs someone who can innovate, Gerald, remember? And I'm just a little too old school. He chuckled, more relief than amusement. Well, old school saved our company. We ended the call, and I sat in the quiet for a long time. For the first time in years, I wasn't holding everything together. I wasn't covering gaps or smoothing panic. I was just breathing. Later that night, I got a message from Bethany. Promoted to Director of Accounting. New leadership wants to rebuild properly. I replied, well earned. Never forget. Keep a parallel audit trail. Always. And for once, I allowed myself to believe things might just hold. 3 months later, I sat on the back deck of my cabin in Asheville, North Carolina, watching the sun dip behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. It wasn't a mansion, just 2 bedrooms and a small office. But it was quiet. And the view? Catherine would have loved it. The investigation had uncovered exactly what I feared. More, actually. A network of shell vendors, fake contracts, inflated consulting fees. Over $13 million quietly drained. Lucas, Eli, and several board members were now facing federal charges for fraud and securities violations. I'd spent 6 weeks assisting the forensic team. No headlines, no interviews. That was part of my condition when ArcLight offered a generous consulting package. Enough to buy this cabin outright and still leave room for peace. One of the final updates came from my lawyer. The SEC had agreed to close their case after ArcLight accepted full responsibility and implemented sweeping governance reforms. No shareholder harm, no pension disruptions. The right people had fallen. The right people had stayed standing. As darkness settled, my phone buzzed again. Bethany. "We're rebuilding," she wrote. "The culture feels different now. Human." I stared at the screen, smiled, then looked down at the leather folio Catherine had given me on our 20th anniversary. Inside, it was the last photo we took together. By a lake, sun hitting the water just right. "You were right," I whispered to her smile. I should have made more time for views like this. The next morning, I drove into town to meet with the director of a small nonprofit that helps displaced workers navigate new careers. They needed help organizing their books, cleaning up grant reporting, tightening expense logs. Nothing flashy. Just the kind of work that keeps good intentions from falling apart. I sat across from their team, young, eager, a little overwhelmed, and explained how to build a budget that breathes, how every number should have a home, how transparency isn't a burden, it's a foundation. As I left, one of them asked, "Mr. Whitaker, do you miss the big leagues?" I paused, then smiled. Not really. I miss integrity. But I've found it again, right here. Later that night, I stood on the porch, the mountains wrapped in dusk. I opened Catherine's folio once more and traced the edge of that photo, her laughing, wind in her hair, not a care in the world. Some might say I'm stuck in the past. But I know better. What they call old school, I call honest work. And that never goes out of style. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been written off, underestimated, or quietly stood your ground, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Someone out there needs to hear this.